I'm like, God, you have to help me here. What is going on? And then I felt this cold presence literally come into the room. And it just came from the side, and this thought came into my mind. Everything your family has believed about the Bible, your mother, your grandmother, it's all a lie. And this total despair, Eric, came over me, like everything I believed in was lost.
Let's get into it, Tim, because I really am fascinated. What are the candidates? In other words, if you talked to somebody 100 years ago and said, hey, where's Mount Sinai? Would they have given a different answer from what we're saying today?
Yes, they would have. And let's talk about that, because there's political intrigue here. A lot of people have looked at the traditional Mount Sinai for a long time. They have felt that that was the place. And in scholars and people who wrote maps and put them in the backs of Bibles always pointed to Mount Sinai, the traditional Mount Sinai, as being the location. But over time, people started to wonder and look for different locations. And then when the Israelis went to after the 6-Day War, they scoured the Sinai for their history, and they didn't find really a lot of evidence around the traditional Mount Sinai. And people would say, well, what would you expect to find? Well, there should be certain clues, and there should be an encampment site there if there are that many people there. Let me share something with you too. Another man by the name of Charles Beek, he was from England. As he looked at that, he had actually won an award for discovering the source of the Nile. And he suggested later on in his writings that Mount Sinai might be in Saudi Arabia, or at the time it was Arabia. It would be on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba if people think about where the Red Sea is and Sinai is.
When was Charles Beek making this claim? What decades are we talking about?
I think this was back in the 1800s. And when he made this claim, he was suggesting that possibly Mount Sinai was in this Arabian area. He actually caused such a stir that they stripped him of his previous medal to basically say, listen, you've gone mad. We all know that the biblical narrative is in the traditional Sinai Peninsula. And so this is where the battle came, when there was biblical passages that pointed towards Arabia. But the challenge then later on in the 19th century is that Arabia became, it's always been under control of Muslims since the 600 AD. It's not been an easy place for people to go into, and especially during that particular time when Beek was, when Saudi Arabia came, it was off limits for people to do this type of exploration of the Bible. And when I went to talk with other archaeologists, they said, you know what, there are sites that we do not have access to that have information pertaining to the Bible, but we're not going to be allowed to go there.
Well, you hear this over and over again, right? I mean, you hear this when I was talking to Stephen Collins, the discoverer of biblical Sodom. He said, for decades, you couldn't go to the Jordan side of the Jordan River and do any excavations there. So, you're absolutely stuck. You hear this over and over through history that certain governments won't let people in there. And so decades and decades pass. This is exciting, folks. We're going to be right back. We're talking to Tim Mahoney. I want you to check out the film itself, May 15th, May 17th. It is a Fathom event, Patterns of Evidence, Journey to Mount Sinai, Part 2. We'll be right back. How did you get involved in biblical archaeology and in these kinds of things? Because I have become more and more and more fascinated with this stuff. What was your journey to Mahoney?
Well, I think that if you wonder about your past and you wonder about how we got somewhere, when I was in high school, my family actually broke up when I was 11 years old, and it was a tragic kind of a breakup. We actually had to go in hiding, Eric, from my father because he wasn't well, and in 11th grade was the first time I started to get back and interested in school. And it was when I was reading a history book, and I started to read ahead. And it was like that scene from when John Candy, when they're like, You remember that scene when they're Steve Martin, John Candy in a movie where they're like in bed and they're all of a sudden they wake up and they start talking about baseball or whatever. And I was like thinking to myself, what in the world am I doing reading ahead in this book? I'm not supposed to be a good student. I don't like this, but I found history was fascinating because I was learning a story. It was the Civil War, and I was going deeper and deeper into it. I couldn't believe what had happened. I finally became aware that something happened earlier in time. And I think that this history, when you ever have a chance to look and you go, well, how did this happen? Where did this happen? And in my own life, I thought I was just going to go on an adventure. But once you go into a place like Egypt and you see the pyramids and you see archaeology and you realize that there was nations here before, there were armies here before, there were pharaohs, and you look at the tombs and you look at go to the British Museum and you see what was created. Human hair from 3,000 years ago, we wove together. I saw this wig that it was both African and like a Norwegian hair that was woven together. And I go, who was this person? Who were these people that all this happened? And you just realize that there's something more. And I think that interest of knowing what the past was about drew me in. And so when I went to Egypt the first time in 2002, I was absolutely astounded by the precision of things that were created, and how in the world did that happen? And then as you bring your faith into it, you realize that God is the creator of everything and that there's a story. And then I became conscious of the fact that Moses, who's in the center of this investigation, gives us how the beginning of the whole universe started. It was during this time that he writes the first books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is the knowledge that we have of how all this came. The origin of all of this comes the flood, the Tower of Babel, all these key events in history. It says that Moses actually talked with God. And God gave him information, and Moses was probably given information passed down from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the children of Israel all the way to Moses. And now we have this book of God working in history. And here I come along, this kid from a broken home who was wanting to be a filmmaker, didn't know what kind of films I was going to make. I got sucked up into, hey, what if we went and looked for the story of the Exodus? And I go to the locations, and then I'm told there is no evidence. And I come home like 3 weeks later and have a total crisis of faith.
Wow. Now I know, or I learned recently that a film about your own life and your own journey was released called The Journey Home, and I know you're talking about that. So initially you're excited. But then you accept this this idea that people are saying there is no evidence for any of this. You accepted it, and you had a crisis of faith at that point. Now, where was that? You're in your 20s. Where were you in life at that point?
No, this was after I'm in like early 40s, and I would probably tell you that I wasn't. I think a lot of people are like this. Something happens in our lives that causes us to question whether God's real, or whether God's word is true, or something like that. Never had that happen before in my life until I was in my early 40s. And that's when I came back from Egypt. And this crisis of faith started to grow like getting the flu. You know, it's like a little not feeling quite well, and all of a sudden it got worse and worse and worse. And I'm so thankful that during this time, I actually had what felt like and I've told this story many, many times because this is what happened. I was in the edit suite looking at the footage and looking at Manfred Betek, this Egyptologist who told me there wasn't any evidence for faith. I mean, there wasn't any evidence for the Israelites. And I'm like, God, you have to help me here. What is going on? And then I felt this cold presence literally come into the room. And it just came from the side, and this thought came into my mind. Everything your family has believed about the Bible, your mother, your grandmother, it's all a lie. And this total despair, Eric, came over me, like everything I believed in was lost. Right after that feeling like I had just fallen into a chasm, another thought came to my mind so strongly. It was, stop editing, get up, go to your office. I got up, walked across the office, walked into my office and said, then the thought was, go to your bookcase, walk over to the bookcase, read that book. And there was a book there by an Egyptologist that had been given to me about a year before. And I had lots of books. I don't read all the books that everyone gives me right away. I pulled this book out, and there I opened it up, and the very dig site that I was looking at in the edit suite was being discussed by this Egyptologist, David Roll. And it had a whole nother interpretation for the arrival of the Israelites, for Joseph's tomb and his palace, all these things that I had no idea. And it was a providential moment in my life where I sensed the battle, the supernatural battle in my own life right there in that edit suite. And then I said, I've got to go to England and film this man. And that began, again, finding answers. And I think that's been the battle that I've been on, is confronting the challenge. And I've tried to do this, as you can tell, by listening to all sides of the debate. That was another key lesson that I learned in making these films. I had to hear from the skeptic. I had to hear from the unbeliever. I had to hear from the different points of view for this to be a legitimate investigation and not just a propaganda film.
So you really have looked into this, and you're at least as fascinated as I am with biblical archaeology. There is so much evidence, and some experts don't agree. Even people that would agree the Bible is the inerrant word of God would disagree on some interpretations or some dating. That's normal. The point is, we're all looking for what is true. We're all trying to get to the bottom of it, and it's an exciting journey, and we should be excited to be on the journey.
Absolutely, and I am very much friendly with and friends with people who are agnostic, people who don't know. I meet more agnostics than I do atheists, to be honest with you. They're just guys who have lots of questions. And we have lots of different viewpoints about chronology, about interpretation, about location. And there are believers that believe very strongly in other mountain locations. For the first time, I'm going to basically share with you where I think the strength of the argument lies. Do we have all the solutions? No, but we have an amazing pattern of evidence. And there's another thing to learn from this. The Israelites were told to come to the mountain, and they're going to worship God there. And during the making of this film, I battled with fear. Fear of am I going to be able to finish this 20-year task? Am I going to be able to find a way to pay for it? And all these different fears. And the Israelites were fearful. They didn't know what they're going to eat, if they're going to have water, where they were going. They were fearful of a lot of things, and they complained. And what I learned from watching this film, and I'm hoping the audience will learn, is that we're going to be called on a journey. Each one of us is on a personal journey, and we can learn from the Israelites what not to do, which is to complain and to look to other things. And at the end of this film, we have a bonus feature that will be on it. And I felt that this film concludes with worship at Mount Sinai. And I've added that component into the end of this film. And I was convicted that, in fact, I was at a coffee shop, and I was walking out, carrying this burden, carrying these fears, and this pastor looked at me, and he said, he was doing a Bible study there, and he looked up, I recognized him from the inner city, and he said, "Tim, how's it going?" I said, I don't even know where to begin. And the first words out of his mouth were, and I know they weren't just his words, he says, "Tim, you need to worship the Lord more." He says, "You need to spend more time in prayer and worship." And I'm like, I don't disagree. And I went home and I told my wife, and I got my guitar out. That night, we ended up just singing and worshiping. And why that is so important. And I think what I have a message in this film is that we need to turn our focus off from some of these problems and all the stuff that's going on. And we need to start focusing on worshiping the Lord, because that's where the peace will come from. And that's how I'm ending this film. I've never done anything like this before, but all across the nation, I'm asking people at the very end of this to stand up with me and to worship the Lord, because we're going to honor the God who called the Israelites out of Egypt and performed all these miracles.
Well, and again, the miracles are so astonishing that we have to remember this happened, folks, that this is who God is. There are times that he will do things like this that are so overwhelming. And we have to make a choice. Do we believe that, or do we just say, well, it couldn't be? Well, I know that these things did happen, but we need to remind ourselves. We need to remind ourselves about what's important. And like you're saying, when we think about all the problems in the world today, I'm all about action, but it has to come from the right place. If it doesn't come from peace with God, a relationship with God, a desire to serve him, then you're just you're tilting at windmills. We can do nothing in our own power.